Welcome to Navigating Net Zero, where we explore the challenges and opportunities of taking climate action in the real world. Each episode, your host Alexia Kelly sits down with leading climate change professionals and experts for honest conversations about what it means to make net zero a reality. Thanks for joining us. Let's dive in.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome back to another episode of Navigating Net Zero. I'm your host, Alexia Kelly, and we are the podcast where we talk about what's working, what's not, and what's next on our global journey to net zero. I am delighted to be talking about a topic that is incredibly important and often neglected and ignored in our policy wonk technocratic conversations about many of these issues. So I'm delighted to be joined here today by the amazing Kalee Kreider. Kalee is one of the best strategic climate communicators in the world, in my opinion. She didn't put that in her bio. For decades, she has advised clients ranging from global philanthropies and thought leaders to Fortune 500 companies. She led communications at the National Geographic Society as Chief Media and Public Affairs Officer, counseled Vice President Al Gore on his environmental and climate communications, including the wildly successful An Inconvenient Truth, and worked with and advised many of the world's most influential climate leaders and organizations. She began her career in Washington, D.C. as a Truman Scholar working for the federal government. Kalee, thanks so much for joining me today.
Alexia, thank you so much. I'm really honored to be here.
Looking forward to the conversation. So you've spent your career advising leaders on how to talk about the climate story. What have you learned about speaking successfully about climate change and the need for urgent action?
Well, first of all, I'll just say that, if you find that your friend who doesn't work on climate change or your parents or others can't really resonate with it, you might want to sit back and rethink whether or not it's going to work with a general audience. If it's a general audience message, which speaks to kind of one of the basics, right, which is know your audience. When you're speaking with other executives, and you know this from having been a chief sustainability officer, if you're speaking CSO to CSO, you speak one way, right? But that's not always the case. And I think one thing that we find difficult in climate, because there is somewhat of a high barrier to entry on some of the concepts and some of the issues, it can be difficult to think about who am I speaking to? Why am I speaking to them? What do I want them to take away? Because we can get kind of siloed from being used to speaking to a certain person in this sphere. I think that's the first. The second is really thinking about who are people going to trust on this issue? Who do they want to hear from? Actually, for some people, they really do want to hear from a scientist, or they really do want to hear from a corporate leader. But sometimes they want to hear from, a local meteorologist. They might want to hear from their family doctor on health. They might want to hear from someone that you and I might not really think about as a quote unquote climate person. And then lastly, there are some phrases that we use, like net zero, that make a perfect amount of sense when we're talking about, setting corporate targets but net zero itself is a complex. The net of net zero isn't even understood by some very, very, very smart people that we know. And so we have some complex language that's also used to describe some pretty complex concepts. And we just have to understand that sometimes we have to take a step back and unpack it, or as my friend Doug Varley likes to say, hum a few more bars, right? And just lay it out a bit more, even for highly educated people who are non-expert in this topic. So I guess those are kind of like my basic starting points.
Yeah, I think those are all excellent advice and things that we forget very often. I remember, and I think perhaps my most shocking foray into communications around these issues was actually when I started at the State Department, because I came in from the NGO space and, had only been out of graduate school a few years. And I feel like the way in which you're trained to speak, particularly as a woman, is that you really want to sound smart, and you want to use big words, and you want to demonstrate your proficiency and mastery of the concepts, of the deep kind of technical nuance that our space both needs and I think is also really hindered by. And when I walked into the State Department and started writing memos, they used to rewrite them, and I would have to rewrite something 10 times before it was ready to go to a principal, because they were like, you have to write this so that a first grader can understand it. And it felt so contrary to me. But the more that I learn about good communications, like, that's actually the sign of a great communicator, right? As someone who can take a very complicated subject and make it accessible and understanding for non-experts, smart people, but who aren't going to understand the nuance when you talk about different types of greenhouse gas accounting, or even what the different greenhouse gases are, right? So say a few more words about how you've seen that play out in your career, and what are the things that we can do to help capacitate professionals who are not professional communicators, but are tasked with communicating to a wide variety of audiences, this incredibly jargon-filled technical world that we live in.
I might give an example, which is,
Please.
I think one of the big breakthroughs we've had really is on methane. And most people, for a long time, a lot of the policymaking was on carbon dioxide, right? It's the most prevalent greenhouse gas, super important because it's long-lived. Half of it lives more than 100 years in the atmosphere. So when you cut it, it really matters because it lives for a long time and it affects many generations. But there are shorter-lived climate pollutants, of which methane is one that only lives, let's say, about 15 years, but shakes out, that's the average, right? It can be like 7 or 8 years. And one of the things that we really tried to look at was not only that global warming and climate change are a problem, but that there's the rate of change as well as the overall change. And so there was a real effort a few years ago to kind of say, like, what are the things that we could do that can make a difference now? Not for like our grandchildren, which is super important, not to dismiss that, but what are the things that we could kind of do now that would make a difference now? And, a group of people really did get together to say, we could be making a difference on methane that would help slow the rate of change and would feel more immediate, be more immediate. Oh, and by the way, there was a lot of research to show that there are steps that oil and gas companies can really take to cut leaks, right? It's very tangible, the kinds of things we could do in one of the major sources of methane. And I really think the methane story is, of course, one of technical achievement, right? Like, we were making real differences there, but it's also a story of how we were able to communicate problem and solution in a new way in climate that we hadn't tackled before, because we hadn't really tried to look at trying to take a problem, making it more immediate, looking at the problem and the solution, and kind of driving into this, what are some of these short-lived problems that we could start to tackle, as opposed to kind of being like this overall thing. There's like 6 major gases, right? We would kind of like actually try to tackle one and make a discrete problem there. But I have seen areas where we can kind of take a piece of the problem and start to solve around that and make real progress with communications as a piece to that puzzle.
So what were some of the specific things that folks did to help raise the profile and awareness around the importance of acting on methane, and ways, how do we get, because I totally agree with you. We've made a ton of progress, especially just in the last couple of years. And methane is having a moment in a way that it has never really had, frankly. We invest a huge amount of work in helping build, I think, momentum and putting some of the infrastructure in place to help accelerate a lot of the technical and policy work related to both methane regulation, but then also mobilizing voluntary action to mitigate methane. I love methane mitigation because I started my career in carbon markets, and it makes great offsets because it's totally measurable. It's completely destroyed once you actually address it. You combust it, it converts into CO2. You've addressed the near-term warming problem. You can measure it, and it's actually incredibly cost effective in many, many applications to go out and do large-scale abatement. So it's sort of the poster child for an area that was really begging for action, but it wasn't sexy, right? Because it's like gas leaks and manure and like landfills, there's like sources of methane are not the like sexy new green technologies that people get super excited about. So how do you see the communications kind of feeding into facilitating methane having the moment that it's had or is having?
Yeah. So one is, I think, making the invisible visible. I think we knew that once we could visualize the emissions, that was going to be an aha moment for people. So remote sensing, so being able to take images from the satellite and putting them over a map and showing where the emissions were. We also took ground measurements in the Permian, right? So you can use drones, you can use airplanes. In addition to the satellites, you can also use ground-based sensors, but showing where the emissions are, mapping them, giving them to local groups, giving that information to them, all of that, which ranged from citizen science to corporate science to nonprofits, right? And the efforts for all of that, by making the invisible visible, allows people who take in information through their five senses to engage in this in a way that was more real to them than theoretical. So I think from the get-go. The second was we actually kind of marketed the methane moment, right? So we had pavilions at events, whether that was at COP, whether that was at ADIPEC, which is the largest oil and gas conference in the Middle East, Sarah Week, which is a large oil and gas conference that's coming up in March in Houston. So actually like saying, sometimes when you say you're having a moment, you're having a moment, if that makes sense. So actually going out and marketing, saying, we're having a methane moment. Here's what that means. Here are images from the satellite. Here's the information. The third was saying not only that we have a problem, but we have a solution. So I think we made it very clear that like, okay, we have these leaks. There's super emitters, there's dispersed emissions. And we're going to go out, we're going to be doing these notifications. There's this thing called Mars, which is a system by which we're immediately trying to get out there and notify companies that there are emissions. And then here's what you can do to fix them. And here are programs to do it. But, and then working with groups of companies to both set targets voluntarily, working with companies to set targets, but there was a whole sort of solutions ecosystem around it so that it wasn't like name and shame. It was actually like, let's raise the bar so that everyone's trying to, race to the top. I think was particularly motivating in terms of storytelling because it kind of created this room like, yep, okay, you're seeing these leaks, but actually it's fixable. And here are all these ways that you go about fixing them. And I'm not saying that name and shame should never be used for sure, but it was an ecosystem around it so that there was also a solutions narrative that this could actually be tackled. Now, as you said, the other thing I thought was interesting is that we've had a range of storytellers, right? It's not just environmentalists and it's not just government, right? It's oil and gas companies, it's farmers. So you can say like, hey, I've got a methane digester on my farm and here's what it is and here's what I'm doing about it. I'm a landfill, I'm doing this. But like, it was this idea that it wasn't just about the Greens or it wasn't just about a government. It's like all of a sudden you had this range of different players that were involved in trying to tackle this problem, which made it, I think, feel possible.
Yeah. And that feeling of possibility, I think, is so crucial because, it's overwhelming and paralyzing, I think, especially when you're first learning about the scale of the problem. And even frankly, for those of us who do this professionally, right, and eat, sleep, and breathe climate, like it requires a lot of disciplined kind of mental structuring. I try and touch base with the science, but I do not read the science every day because it scares me too much. And so you have to figure out how to space that out so that you can continue to function, and that focusing on, things are really bad, like being truthful about acknowledging where we are, but also really giving people that sense of, but it's not a foregone conclusion, right? And like every little bit that you can contribute actually really does make a difference because the margins of warming, the nths of the degree really do matter. But that accountability as well is critically important, right? Like I think one of the reasons we're having so much success and traction on methane right now is because polluters can't hide anymore and they can't lie anymore. We can see it. So talk about that carrot stick balance in climate communications and advocacy more broadly, right? Because I think this is a real tension that we grapple with, certainly in the work that we do, is how do you hold that accountability, transparency, and the name and shame alongside the need to reward and recognize and create safe space for what will inevitably be imperfect movement forward.
First learned about this on something called the toxic release inventory. So way back in the day, we didn't know what the releases were from, good old-fashioned chemical plants. And the federal government created this registry where companies had to start reporting their toxic releases. And it was fascinating because As soon as they published the registry, no company wanted to be like the largest polluter on the toxic release inventory. It's called the TRI. And truly, like one of the groups had like 2 full-time people that just monitored the TRI. They created a map, they put out the map, they showed the map, and it created an incentive for companies once these data were made public to not want to be on there. And it was very powerful for me as someone in their 20s to see the TRI, because this was like pre-internet when this first came out. So you had to use like the traditional media, right? And like old-fashioned maps and, but it's why I think this same instinct, right, is what still works today, which is that companies still care. They don't want to be the worst. They'd like to be the best, or at least close to being the best. So it absolutely helps for those who work in the public interest to help to publicize these data and create data stories, which help to make these come to life in ways that are compelling to the public. And that includes, now what's so interesting, you can now go out and I was just looking out and trying out some new things. You can now use AI agents to do real-time focus groups and sentiment data so that you can see, like, does this work better? Does that work better? Even with Facebook now, you can create ads and images, and you can in real time be like, is X better or Y better? Is this better or is that better? Like, do people understand the data better or simpler? It's actually easier to test how people are ingesting and taking in data now than it was then. It was much more expensive, right? Like, is purple a better color or yellow a better color? Like, these things all matter to how people understand data and infographics. So as we're getting this information from satellites or from airplanes or from drones to see where the emissions are coming from, telling the stories of what's being seen is in an accurate way is really important for how people understand what it means. So you don't want that tree to fall in the forest and no one to hear about it. The issue is, though, you have to give the data the chance to have impact or solution, or else people go from awareness to despair. And that would be a shame, because people have too much going on in their lives. You can't just give them information that there's a problem without a sense that there is a way to solve it, either for them to solve it or that someone is trying to solve it.
So obviously, An Inconvenient Truth, like, fundamentally changed the conversation around climate, I would say, in the United States. What do you think made that particular exercise so successful? And how would you go about that differently now with all of these new tools that we have available?
I joke that An Inconvenient Truth is a little bit like Woodstock. Like, more people say they saw An Inconvenient Truth than actually saw it in the theater, because if they all actually saw it in the theater, we would have sold even more tickets. But at its time, it was one of the most watched documentaries in history. It did receive 2 Oscars. That was like the heyday, the beginning of and the heyday of documentary filmmaking. We were the first film, we think, that ever had a Facebook page. And I remember when we were like, should we make a Facebook page for a movie? And people were like, why would you do that? Which is funny, because now, like, of course you would. Twitter wasn't really a thing. Like, just to give you an idea, it's not that long ago, like 05, 06 is not that long ago, but it seems like a world ago in terms of social media, the media. So some of the things we did right. First of all, I think An Inconvenient Truth needs to be understood, both that people went to see An Inconvenient Truth in part because they wanted to see what motivated Al Gore. He had lost the election. He wasn't out in the public that much, but some people had a sense of regret about what had happened. It was not a political moment on climate. Many people did not experience it that way. There was no legislation pending, but there were many people, Republican and Democrat, that just wanted to know what happened to Al Gore and what made him tick. So when we had focus groups around it, to use a mythological example, they saw it as a Phoenix Rising story. So while climate people saw it as like a baby boomer with a PowerPoint talking about climate, many people experienced it as a human redemption story.
Oh, interesting.
So you have to think about, if most stories are like, this is using old school language, but you'll understand what I mean. When we were in school, They were like, it's man versus man versus nature, man versus himself. Remember those like old school ways we were to understand storytelling? They were like, who is Al Gore? Because it was man versus man and he lost the 2000 election. And they wanted to know, who is he? So when they came to understand his true passion, the film brought to life an issue through the lens of his eyes. And through that, they came to understand that this issue and him.
Interesting.
And then the images that stuck with them were the glacial retreat images. Those were the ones that popped the most for people, the before and after images, because they had an aha moment. That and the one where he went up on the lift and they saw how much higher the temperature was than the historical average. So people had a few takeaways from it, but it wasn't the same for the average viewer than it was for the climate literate.
Interesting.
Right.
But I think this is such an interesting point, because I feel like we are really suffering from a deficit of truly effective spokespeople on many of these issues out there in the world today, right? Like, you can count on one hand the people who are sort of commonly pointed to as extraordinary communicators on climate. And I think it's an interesting conundrum, I think, a little bit, because really, like, we all need to be extraordinary communicators on climate in order to solve this problem and to make the kind of progress that we need to be making at the speed and scale we need to be making it.
Well, I think some people took the wrong message from Al's film. I think the message they took was, if I use a bunch of facts like him, people will understand climate.
Totally.
And I believe the message of the film was that people came to understand him, the loss of his sister, how he rebuilt his life around his passion. But it wasn't the PowerPoint that necessarily was the nature of the film, right? And so if you notice, a lot of the documentaries, I would say, to answer your question about what we would do now, you probably wouldn't do a documentary now. Most people don't watch 90-minute films on a topic, right?
Especially not on paralyzingly depressing topics.
Right. Since then, probably the only really breakthrough film was one that was more of a humor film, right? It was Don't Look Up. And now, it might be a TikTok series, it might be, it might be like, you might use a completely different form now.
Yeah.
But if you were to try to do a formatted type of, you know what I mean? Something that was scripted, but some of the other things we did well, we worked really closely with Move On and Sierra Club and a bunch of the NGOs. So we had tabling at every theater about local group issues. We sent out emails to folks to come out to, there were almost like little parties and gatherings at every one of the movie openings, which was really neat. Al would do meetings with them. We did company meetings, and you and I have talked about this in the past, where he went out and met with Walmart, he met with Pepsi, he met with both at the corporate level and with the staff level, he met with the leadership of the Mormon Church, he met with anyone that wanted to just talk about climate. He talked about, during that era, off the record, no press, no conversation, just kind of like an ask me anything. How many people he met during that period, how many people I bump into to this day who are like, I met Al Gore at my company at An Inconvenient Truth film opening, and it convinced me that I wanted to spend my life working on clean energy, or I decided to go work for an NGO, or I'm now, I founded a company, a battery company. It's absolutely extraordinary. He met and helped inspire so many people with the film as kind of like a vehicle to go and do that. And to me, the movie, in a way, was like one piece of this broader effort for him to go out and connect with all these people who, I think, from the 2000 campaign, really liked him or admired him or identified with him in some way, but now could connect with him as a human because they realized where his true passions lay.
I want to talk about this for a minute, because this is such an important and, I think, kind of challenging space for us to engage in as climate communicators. I am 100% dyed-in-the-wool technocrat. Like, if we just explain it better, surely they'll understand, how right we are and that we should all get on board. And I think it's pretty evident that, that approach is not working, right? The facts are not helping us catalyze the kind of large-scale change that we really. There are very good reasons for that I don't know that any amount of communication is going to help us really actually be able to totally overcome. But anybody who's worked in the carbon markets or the net zero space in the last 5 years can see how powerful getting a message right or wrong can be in shaping public opinion, in shaping influencer opinion, and frankly, in moving markets, right? Like, just look at what's happened with Claude and OpenChatGPT in the last 2 weeks. Like, we're seeing almost instantaneous market response based on widespread messaging and public pressure campaigns. And so, talk a little bit about how you recommend folks balance the need to speak factually and in a detailed and technically correct way, but also the need to sort of bring that more emotional aspect to our communications, which we've frankly been trained and told both as women and as general communicators that like we just shouldn't do, right? Like your credibility comes in being impartial and reserved and very factually correct. And so talk a little bit about how we balance that as communicators moving forward, because I totally agree. It's so important. And also it's very difficult to sort of strike that right balance.
There's a lot of research that shows the information deficit model is not accurate, meaning that it's not that giving more information for most audiences is not going to be what moves them. There are some people for whom they need information, but think about it this way. The majority of people in this country didn't go to college. So information isn't the way to move them. And even then, when you're looking at graduate postdoc, right, the numbers fall off dramatically. So there are a lot of people for whom information is not what moves them to take decisions. And even among highly intelligent people, right? Like you have very intelligent people who are smokers, right? I mean, they know smoking's bad for them and they still smoke, or you know what I mean? Like do all sorts of things that are unhealthy. It's not they don't have the information. They just aren't taking decisions based on that information. So how people make decisions is super intriguing research, which I love. Look, I think there's a couple things on climate that are hard. One, you look at how President Obama picked his cabinet versus President Trump. President Obama picked Nobel laureates and experts in his first term. President Trump picked Fox News hosts. Notwithstanding that, what they were picking for, President Trump tended to pick communicators. People who looked good, sounded good, could deliver sound bites. President Obama was picking like the smartest physicists to run DOE. Neither of them were picking for management, by the way, which is what those jobs really are when you actually strip it all away, right? Like when you're a secretary of a department, like actually what you're doing is you're managing a lot of people. But it's interesting what they were both hiring for. So what does that tell you? It tells you that Democrats tend to hire experts, whereas MAGA Republicans have tended to hire communicators. And you can kind of see the downstream implications of those decisions. It's really hard for experts to be great communicators because their educational training doesn't lend itself to the understanding the basics of communications, 3 message points repeated often, right? And so notwithstanding whether or not they manage their departments well, I think what's hard for folks in climate is to understand that communications is actually in and of itself a job. So when I was a working spokesperson, right, I trained for it weekly, bi-weekly. I sat down, I went through my message points, I delivered them in front of a camera, I used more Botox, I used more filler, I was thinner, right? Because when you're on television, the very first thing someone says to you is, you looked great. Why is that? Because television is a visual medium. The second thing is like, you sounded amazing, right? Because they're listening to the tone and quality of your voice. And then the third is they might remember something that you said because you delivered like a killer soundbite. But what does our side train for? Our side trains to say a whole bunch of stuff really fast. So when I did my first media training, the very first thing, because I was like a high school, college debater, right? They were like, you talk way too fast. They were like, you need to deliver half that much content. And I was like, what? It was terrifying to me because I was like, I can't deliver that half that much content. And they were like, well, no one's going to remember it anyway, so don't deliver it. And that terrified me. And they're like, you're actually going to get scored for looks, the tone of your voice, and how many times you deliver your soundbite. And it destroyed me. Like I was like, I don't know if I can be a spokesperson because that just, like, look, you're an Olympic swimmer of communication when you become a spokesperson. So you're going to be judged on certain criteria. Like they were like, think about ice skating, right? Like I'm going to hold up a card, and on this card is going to be a number, and it's going to be scored on points for this. For people who are experts in climate, they almost can't register that for broadcast and print media, like what that would mean. They would have to think so differently about how they interact with the world.
So this is a great segue actually into the other thing that I wanted to talk to you about, which is social media. So social media has fundamentally transformed how we communicate. One of my very favorite things about social media is how it democratizes access to both, broad audiences, specialized audiences, and people who you would just never meet. Some of my favorite people in climate I have met on LinkedIn and then had the pleasure of meeting in person. And now we work together on a variety of things. And it's really, I love that, right? Like I'm having a deep debate with somebody in Bangalore, India from a technical college about a specific greenhouse gas accounting point, halfway around the world, like on social media. It's such a different platform than traditional print and visual media have been. And so how do we as climate communicators think about leveraging social media and the incredible speed, the almost blinding speed with which all of these technologies are changing and adapting?
So think of social media as a number of different things, right? Because many of them are speaking to different audiences. So LinkedIn, right, is mostly to a business and educated audience. It's an incredible tool, and it is probably the single best platform to reach, business audiences, high-level NGO audiences. Like every CEO or C-suite person, right, should be using LinkedIn right now to communicate. But there are other platforms that are doing very different things in social media that are so much different than LinkedIn, it's almost hard to have them under the same umbrella in a certain way, right? Because communicating on Instagram is very, very different than communicating on LinkedIn. Like there is some best practice that cuts across, but your Instagram post is going to be very different, right? Much less text, much more visual, much broader audience than your LinkedIn post is going to be. There are some people, in fact, who are like, I use Facebook for personal, I use LinkedIn for professional, I use Instagram for wide audience, I use TikTok for my recipes. But for communication, you really have to sit back and look at what am I using each one of these channels and why? Because they are different and the algorithms are different. And what's interesting now is that they are laddering up to, ChatGPT and these newer platforms, and they are now starting to use that content and putting it together in new and interesting ways. So it's now laddering up to sort of a different, we used to call, it's sort of like search and engine optimization. You now have a different type of optimization that's being used by Gemini and ChatGPT and the others, which is kind of an emerging field. Because what you're finding, and the reason why website traffic is dropping, is now ChatGPT and the others aren't, and I'm not endorsing one or the other. I use them all. Are now using all that content to train their own systems. The one downside of what you would call a disintermediated media, meaning that the democratization that you're talking about, is that traditional media has largely collapsed. And so the disinformation part is very difficult and has been very difficult for the climate community to grapple with. That there's no longer an ability for issues that are not top tier. And by that, I mean like the Iran war or what happened to Savannah Guthrie's poor mother, or, an issue that was top tier media. For the second and third tier issues, it's now much more difficult to capture attention or drive a narrative because the media is disintermediated, meaning cutting across all these different platforms, and it's much more difficult to capture attention. Google search does that little chart at the end of the year and looks at all the top stories. Like climate's not really there across these disaggregated platforms.
Yeah, and it's so interesting because I think that disintermediation that you're speaking of, I think has created a world in which we really do live in different worlds. Right? I actually believe it was a broke democracy in America, right? Like we didn't have that kind of fair and balanced presentation of the middle view. The algorithms were rewarding what do you like? What are you responding to? And they're much better at, I mean, they almost predict I want things before I even know I want them. I mean, it's just crazy. And so how do you think about that sort of as part of your communication when you know that like we are being siphoned and we are self-siphoning so that we really aren't ever getting a complete picture of an issue or a set of issues through any social media platform, I don't think at this point, right? Like my LinkedIn feed looks completely different than my husband's who's in a different sector. And they cross occasionally, but when they do, it's very confusing, right? So, like, how do you sort of be a responsible consumer of media? And how are you a responsible influencer of media, knowing, that we have this crazy bifurcation right now?
Yeah. A friend of mine named Eli Pariser years ago, at the front end of this phenomenon, wrote a book called The Filter Bubble. And it was exactly about that phenomenon, about how the filters, the algorithms are creating these bubbles around ourselves and what some of the challenges are. And believe it or not, Vice President Gore's college thesis was about how changes in media, whether it was the printing press or radio, like changed politics. And he particularly focused about how the rise of radio led to the rise of fascism. And because media technology affects politics because of how it gets used or misused.
Clearly. I
And,
think we're seeing that in spades right now, right?
you really
Yeah.
are.
Yeah.
And so I know, of course, I had to read everything when I worked for him. I had to read everything he'd ever written because, it could always come back. So it's fascinating. You don't always get to read someone's thesis, So fortunately, no one read mine because mine was on Stolypin land reform, the late Tsarist period, which, no one's going to read but my advisor. So I would say this. I think what it challenges us to do is to think about how so the push for many years was to create a climate beat at traditional media outlets. So we wanted to climate beat the New York Times. We wanted to climate beat at CNBC. We wanted to climate beat at CNN, right? So that was the push for a long time. And then in doing so, it would raise the visibility of climate issues writ large. Now, I think we have a different challenge, which is how do we embed issue knowledge and coverage of climate across what people are talking about, weather, food, the things that we care about, fashion. How do we embed that into the coverage that's already happening? Because as you said, it's democratized. There aren't going to be beat reporters on TikTok. There aren't going to be beat reporters on LinkedIn because we are the reporters. We are us. They are them. The beating heart is within us. So how do we create a ubiquity within? And that's going to mean more influencer strategy to help with that kind of embed. It's going to result in mainstreaming, which means we're going to have less control over how it's talked about. And it is going to mean that the mainstream media coverage we do get in what are now kind of what I would call the mega outlets, like the New York Times, we're going to have to amplify that coverage more than we did because there are going to be fewer, bigger, better media outlets that we're going to have to work for placement in and then leverage out. I also think we're going to have to get more creative about our overall storytelling. And that includes podcasts like this, but it also includes 90-second little mini docs. It includes photography. It's going to include visual arts, AI generated content, like areas that I'm not sure we have deeply plumbed from a creative, rather than throwing soup cans at art. I think we're going to actually have to be much more creative about how we and what ways that we communicate, because I sit down in the morning and I read the Times, the Post, the FT, Politico, Bloomberg. I go through all of that, right? And then I go out on my channels and that's not how young people are consuming content. I might as well be my grandpa sitting and reading the Evening Post in this easy chair.
Yeah, it's much more passive, right? I don't know that most people are proactively going out and searching information. It's, oh, if it pops up in my feed, then I'll click on it or read it. I do want to ask you about short form versus long form too, because I think certainly in the technocrat world I live in, I'm seeing a shift to longer form, like a lot of people moving to Substack and writing longer pieces combined with the like pressure to be really short, right? And really succinct and pithy and lots of white space in your LinkedIn posts and short, succinct statements. And, how do you really sort of just say what you have to say in an eye-catching and as few words as possible? And there's certainly tension in both of those things, but from an overall trends perspective, what are you seeing? And are people really actually engaging more with long form media like Substack and podcasts even versus just continuing to kind of scroll through their feed?
I think it depends on who your audience is,
Yeah.
for sure. For people like us, I think we're consuming more Substack content than books and more Substack content than documentaries, right? But for younger people, the 2-3 swipe rule you know what I mean? Like, it's very hard to get them to engage in longer form content.
Yeah.
I think the other thing we definitely need to think about is how and in what way are we engaging on educational materials at a younger age? One thing that's been really hard, and I remember this with An Inconvenient Truth, but it's still true today. It's really hard to get the climate community and philanthropies to fund basic educational materials. And we ended up having to fund it ourselves, but everything from working on the AP course on environmental science to materials for elementary school. And this goes for homeschool education, for private school education, for public school education, because the time that we get most attention, right, is actually when kids are younger. By the time they're 18, I think they say you spend like 90% of the time you're going to spend with your kids. So we need to think of the attention and the time that we're getting to educate people about these issues pre-18, then college for the less than half that are going to go. And then these other pieces, which I think has been a little bit of a missing link to the work that we have had on climate. And I think part of that is, what's the KPI? Like, it's very hard to show the KPIs for that type of education. But then when you actually think about it, you're like, oh, yeah, right. If they learn about it when they're young, it's a heck of a lot easier than later to say, oh, you should be supporting X or Y or Z when you're 30.
It's funny. I often ask people how they got into working on climate, and I would say 90% of them say, I spent a lot of time outdoors as a kid.
Yeah.
Right. Like that was like, I have that connection to nature. I was outdoors a lot. That is a core part of who I was and how I identify. And that's then kind of influenced my interest in pursuing a profession. That was certainly the case for me. I don't know about for you.
Yep. And as you are seeing more kids homeschooled, as you're seeing, like there's lots of educational programming that I think we can truly think about. National Geographic worked really hard on these programs. There are others. I think we're going to have to get more and more creative about working with our parks and recreation groups. I think we're going to be more integrated in thinking across about how we build education and affinity in order to move people, through their lifetimes.
Yeah.
Because we're simply not going to have the kinds of opportunities that we would have to, get that one killer New York Times story and all of a sudden it bursts through and it creates the action that we're hoping for,
Yeah. I want to pivot and ask you a question about markets. You and I have talked about this a lot, but market-based solutions to climate have had a rough few years, while also, I think, demonstrating significant traction and successful outcomes, as in the case of the EU ETS, which is under attack at the moment, but has done a just phenomenal job of rapidly reducing emissions across Europe. And what do you think we've gotten wrong in communicating about kind of leveraging markets for accelerated climate action? And what do you think we could be doing better to help really accelerate uptake and acceptance of sort of the necessity of engaging with markets to help us solve these big economic system failures?
Look, it's been sort of an historically interesting time because there is a skepticism, somewhat of a skepticism that has emerged about markets because of the like the '07 crash, right? Like there's a certain segment of people that I think had their confidence in markets hit, and there's been a long tail from that. And look, we saw that with the Waxman-Markey bill, right? That this came along right at the time of a crash. And the mix and stir of that was really, really tough to try to get a market-based solution in the US, for example. I also think, just as a backdrop, I think it's also been hard for the EU to have their market stood up when we didn't stand ours up, right? So they've had to kind of plug along at a time when really it would have been much easier for them had more markets gotten stood up that they could have plugged into, right? Which would have smoothed the edges of some of the issues. So I put all that out there as a backdrop to say that there were some headwinds that we wouldn't have anticipated when those things got stood up in the late 90s, early aughts. So that said, I think market-based solutions, well, and I'll add one more thing, which is that what's interesting is that Republicans haven't really forcefully articulated the pluses of markets as when it has come to climate, which one would have anticipated, both given the U.S. Clean Air Act, which had that built in, which Republicans supported. So it's been slightly hurt also by the fact that we didn't have kind of the strange bedfellows. One of the most potent things you have is when you have strange bedfellows coming forward to say that something works. So if I could wave a wand right now and say, what's the one thing that I wish we could be doing right now in markets, it would be to have that kind of mix of Republicans, Democrats, business leaders, and environmentalists coming together to talk about how unleashing private markets to solve a problem is the single best thing we could be doing on climate, and providing 3 concrete examples. Like, to me, that would be the most powerful thing we could be doing.
Yeah.
And if we had that, it would make a huge, huge difference. And we truly should, because it is an approach that has and can still unleash huge forces to help solve this problem.
Yeah, totally. And I think if you think back to the early days and what predated Waxman-Markey in the United States, right, it was the U.S. Climate Action Partnership. It was the nonprofit sitting down in a professionally facilitated space with big emitters who had sort of accepted that regulation was coming and wanted to be at the table as it was being developed. And so they showed up, and said, yep, we're here and let's negotiate. And we negotiated, right? Like, I was at WRI at the time, and we were sitting there, and through the blueprint, we walked through, here's all the elements of a national cap and trade system that we would want to see. And I spent a lot of time pushing back on companies, actually saying, yeah, sure, offsets can be part of the program, but we're going to put limitations on them. They have to be high quality. Here's what it has to look like. And that was a really powerful and effective way to figure out, like, where is that kind of center landing ground, on the policy front that works for everybody, that we then built a coalition, an advocacy coalition around. And, we were so close.
US CAP, which was the acronym for that, was so amazing, because you had a couple oil and gas companies, you had other major Fortune 500 companies, you had NGOs, you had former government people, that had kind of come together. And that's what it had. It had that strange bedfellows feel. You had bipartisan folks that ultimately came onto the bill as a result. And to me, I know right now it doesn't feel like that isn't likely. And I will say, having lived through the 2000 election, it did not feel like that was going to happen anytime soon. And I still think it's possible.
Yeah.
I actually still think it's possible. I think it's possible for a lot of reasons. One, I do think that because of the deficit, which is, because of
because of CBAM, I think the carbon border adjustment mechanism coming out of Europe. I mean, Europe finally, to your point, got tired of waiting for everybody to show up with their own climate legislation, said, okay, we cannot, politically, we cannot continue to leave our economic sectors to be the only ones to be carrying a real price on carbon in the entire global economy. We have to be honest, it is a competitive disadvantage in many instances, especially in trade exposed, energy intensive industries that are globally commodified. And so I agree with you, actually. I think there might be a window of opportunity here to really start thinking about, especially as Asian markets start to spin up, What would a more globally integrated network of high integrity cap and trade systems look like?
And Trump has done tariffs.
Right. We know
I
the
mean,
man
let's
loves
be honest.
tariffs.
But the other thing is that he's essentially increased the costs
Of
of a
everything.
number of
Yeah.
things which actually are carbon intensive. And so there's actually the elements of a roadmap here
Mm-hmm.
that I think it's difficult for people to see through the fog of the fog. I'll just put it that way.
Yep.
And it just wouldn't surprise me if in a couple years' time, people sit back and say, we put these three things together. We will have to think about some political things, what we call it, what it looks like, how it comes together, where the revenues go. I think the biggest issue for the US is going to be just how high the deficits are. You and I haven't seen deficits like this in our lifetime. And secondly, where we are on the back end of, Iran, Ukraine, etc. But I think we could be surprised at where we find ourselves in, 2, 4, 6 years
Yep.
on these issues.
And that's how long it's going to take to build consensus and alignment. Like, it's going to take a little bit of time.
But I do think markets is the way. I just think inherently markets is going to be the way because it is the path that is bipartisan, that industry will support, that NGOs will support, and the devil will be like in the details around that.
Always. So, Kalee, I would love your just best advice for people working in climate change. Like, what are 3 things we should be doing to help contribute to effective communication around climate?
Maybe I'll go simple to difficult. Simple is to actually see communication as something that is in and of itself as valuable as science or legal. Like it is a practice in and of itself. It's not an add-on.
That's not an afterthought.
Right. So I think that's piece number 1. The second is what flows from that then is to actually then think about and be very rigorous about who are you trying to talk to? What do you want them to take away? And then who are they going to trust to say it? And be humble enough, which, I have to I have to sit back and say this to myself. It might not be you, right? It might be a young person in your office. It might be someone that, but that's something, and I think corporates are really grappling with that. Everyone's kind of trying to deal with who is that trusted messenger in addition to the messages and the audiences. And then the last thing is that as you kind of put together that sort of planning is to think about, look, we all have to give each other some space and grace to understand that in this time, it's kind of a classic threat and opportunity. On the one hand, we can be very creative, right? Because it's a little bit hard to make progress right now. So let's use the time to be creative and try some things that work, but also give each other the space to say, well, okay, that didn't work so well. That's okay. Because the media landscape is changing, the policy landscape is changing, like there's a whole lot of things going on. So let's use this time to try some new things and see what's working, what's not. Let's test it. Let's afterward kind of look back and say, well, do a review of it. But I would say use the time to be creative in the practice, review it, do some KPIs and try again rather than be stuck in old ways of thinking.
Yeah. I always love to close with what's getting you out of bed in the morning and what are you feeling most optimistic about?
Well, so I live on a farm. So literally what gets me out of bed in the morning are like my chickens, my garden, let me just say it's very humbling to live on a farm. I'm the wife with a job in town, so my husband is an actual 5th generation farmer. I am not. So, Alexia, I think I come up with these crazy injuries because farming's really hard. And my background, particularly as you now know what my college thesis was, did not prepare me for farm life. So that's literally what gets me up. But what gets me out of bed on climate, I will say, is this: because it's not linear, right? Like addressing this problem is not linear. I guess I don't experience the downs as much because It's like you go Paris Agreement, you have these moments, and I try not to be on any kind of roller coaster with it because there's just things I'm not in control of. So I guess for me, I do find some joy in the creativity of the moment, right? And what I'm seeing out there, whether it's philanthropies, whether it's companies, whether it's NGOs. We might have a little less of that in US government, but we do have it in governments in other countries, right? That are working on energy access and something. There's actually a lot going on.
Oh, yeah.
And to me, I find that exciting, even though it's not a Paris moment. But there are other moments that I find to be like the remote sensing work. I mean, there's a project at WRI now where they can look at saplings growing into trees, like the amount of resolution that they have. It's amazing. There's just some amazing work going on right now that I think is going to bear fruit in the very near term.
Yeah, I love that and totally agree. Well, Kalee, thank you so much for joining me today. It was, as always, a true pleasure to speak with you, and keep up the good work.
Thank you so much. If I'm lucky, do I get invited back? Like, can I be on rotation?
Absolutely.
Thank you. Just make sure to put me in the loop.
Yes.
Alexia, thanks so much for having me on. I really enjoyed it.
That's it for this episode of Navigating Net Zero. If you enjoyed the conversation, be sure to follow or subscribe, and help us spread the word by sharing this episode with your friends and colleagues. Thank you for listening. Until next time, be well and keep up the great work.